Okay, good morning from Jakarta and good evening to other fellows in the United States. Welcome to Women in Foreign Policy, a public discussion series from FPCI. I'm Atika, a researcher at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN Indonesia. I will be moderating today's discussion. This public discussion is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and the United States Embassy in Jakarta, and is part of the Women in Foreign Policy public discussion series. The Women in Foreign Policy is a program collaboration between FPCI and the United States Embassy in Jakarta, with the objective to highlight increase and advance Indonesian women participation in foreign policy conversation in the country. And the Women Foreign Policy public discussion series will feature participation of FPCI women in foreign policy fellows who are rising women foreign policy thinkers in Indonesia, alongside experts and thought leaders in the field. And gladly, I'm one of the 20 fellows who have participated in the Indonesian Women in Foreign Policy Forum. And today, I think we're gonna have a great discussion on the ways we can reinvigorate commitment for democratic resilience and good governance. And I think talking about the state of democracy around the world and its surrounding debates is a very relevant and timely topic, as we all know that 2024 will be an important year for democracies worldwide. Three of the largest democratic nation in the world, including the US, Indonesia, and India, will hold general election. In the next year, we can expect that some 3 billion people worldwide will use their rights to vote. Collectively, we can imagine the impact of this election will somewhat determine the trajectory of global democracy and governance in the following years. However, we can say also the state of democracy is ever fluctuating, and the rules of governance around the world are ever changing. As such, I think this public forum seeks to address contemporary challenges, such as increasing polarization, the rise of populism, the new media and information landscape, and the new meaning of democracy and governance in today's present age. Therefore, I believe that this discussion will provide an opportunity for us to reflect on the challenges to and achievements of democracy over the past 5 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, to address this development, I think today's public discussion will feature renowned and highly regarded professionals, from academic professors, researchers, and journalists. And I really agree that they have great attention on democracy and governance issues. The speakers are first, Professor Donald K. Emerson. Prof. Emerson is a senior fellow emeritus at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Sorenstein APA-RC, Stanford University. Prof. Emerson has particular interest on comparative politics, Indonesian politics and foreign policy, and also Asia-Pacific regionalism and democracy. Welcome, Prof. Emerson, to our discussion. It's an honor for us to have you here today. Another speaker is Ms. Joanna Kao, Senior Director, Asia-Pacific at International Republican Institute. She has wide experiences in international political development, citizen empowerment, and has observed elections, including in Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and Cambodia. Welcome, Ms. Joanna. Nice to meet you. And for today's discussion, we also have Pak Bambang Harimurti, the commissioner at Tempo, an Indonesian-based media company. Welcome, Pak Bambang.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Bambang. And last but not least speaker is Ms. Ika Krismantari. She is the Women in Foreign Policy Fellow, and importantly, she is also the chief editor and content director of the Conversation Indonesia. I think you're already aware of the Conversation. In the Conversation Indonesia commits to publish a research-based news and analysis. Welcome, Mbak Ika.
Thank you, Mbak Atika. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And for your information, we also have over 600 registered participants in the discussion from more than 10 countries. Okay, and now before we begin the discussion, I would like to kindly remind all of the participants of some housekeeping rules. First, we respectfully ask participants to keep their microphones muted while the panelists are speaking. And secondly, you are welcome to raise questions either through the chat box and Q&A box, and you will also be given the chance to directly ask your question on your own during the Q&A session. Okay, and I think without further ado, let us now hear from our panelists on the topic of today's discussion, the invigorating commitment for democratic resilience and good governance. Just to let you know that we will have 2 rounds of discussion and we'll continue to Q&A session. Okay, let me start the first round of the discussion. Okay, maybe I will start my first question to Prof. Emerson. Hi, Prof. Emerson.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, I just want to maybe raise some question. It seems that, you know, that the global struggle for democracy reached a turning point in 2022. We can see from the 2023 report on freedom in the world that the gap between the number of countries that show overall improvements in political rights and civil liberty and countries that indicate a decline was quite narrow. I think you're aware on that. And could you tell us what actually the key current trends in democracy worldwide? In which direction do you see the current status of global democracy? And is democracy really backsliding now? And how will you connect it with global inequality? I think it will be an interesting issue also. And in particular, maybe you can also share with us the trends we are seeing in the US, for example, what happened at the US Capitol building, you know, on 6th of January 2021. Please, Prof. Emerson, you can share your thoughts.
Well, you've covered a vast, vast series of topics. I'm sorry, I can't cover all of those briefly. It would be impossible to do. What I thought I could do, however, is set the stage, introduce the topic. Sorry, just a minute. Conceptually. And I hope you don't mind. I prepared just a couple of paragraphs that I think will help us sort of introduce the topic without actually going straight into the details. In discussions of global affairs, including our discussion today, it is always useful to distinguish between structure and agency. Now, forgive me, I'm an academic, and so I tend to make abstractions. Structure versus agency, between embedded distributions of power, structure that may be hard to change, and the roles of individual and collective actors who can and may cause, alter, postpone, or even prevent such change from taking place. So I'm talking about structures and actors. Last year, in 2022, for the first time, the population of planet Earth reached 8 billion people. And our global economy exceeded $100 trillion in value. And yet observers disagree about the current structure of world affairs. 2 dichotomies are competing for attention. Some leaders prefer a vertical and mainly economic contrast between the developed, quote unquote, global North and the less developed, quote unquote, global South. Last month, India's Prime Minister Modi told the US Congress that the global South is the way forward. I'm not sure he specified forward to what, but the way forward. And some say that Modi hopes to lead the global South in reforming the world's current geopolitical structure. US President Biden has in the past offered a horizontal, not vertical, but horizontal and partly ideological contrast between Western democracy and what he then called Middle Eastern autocracy. Now, that was some years ago. His aversion to despotic rule in Russia and China suggests a broader rejection of Eastern autocracy, even though he did not use and does not use that adjective. As for structure and agency, these 2 bits of economic and political geometry, north-south and west-east, are problematic. The world is not divided into 4 neatly circumscribed, internally homogeneous, and traditionally identified blocks. That seems clear to me. As for structure, consider the association of the North and the West with economic growth and wealth, as opposed to the more impoverished South and East. The Gini index of inequality runs on a scale from 0 or complete equality, where everyone has the exact same income, to 100, where one person gets all of the income in the world. In recent decades, inequality among individuals within countries has admittedly increased slightly, but inequality between countries continues to fall and is now down to its lowest level in well over a century. One analyst concludes accordingly in an article optimistically entitled "The Great Convergence," right, as if North and South were converging and East and West were converging in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, that in terms of the distribution of income, the world as a whole is the most equal it has been in more than a century. If this trend continues, which I suppose one could hope that it will become even harder to lump countries into blocks according to where they are on a map. Meanwhile, however, for multiple reasons, including history, geography, demography, culture, political economy, the 5 richest countries by GDP, the US, China, Japan, Germany, and India, in that order, together account for more than half of global GDP. Interestingly, China, with 18% of the world economy, is still behind the US, which has 25%. But the structural lesson to be learned is that a stable future global order cannot be unipolar or bipolar or reflect the primacy of any single region. It must instead be multiply, plurally, I'm tempted to say, yes, democratically led. And that morally and empirically constructive outcome, in my view, is certainly endangered by structural differences. I admit that. By far the most immediate threat to the world stems from the expansionist agency of certain key leaders, of actors, Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, Xi Jinping potentially against Taiwan, and if I may say so, regarding my own country, Donald Trump against democracy in America. And that leads me into an analysis of the Trump situation, which I'm happy to do, but at least that gives you some background. I'm optimistic by these economic trends, but at the same time, it seems to me the individual actors involved, particularly the ones I've just mentioned, can seriously damage the potential for democracy at a global level. And now we can get into a back and forth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Emerson. It's very interesting. You touch upon some of the theoretical concepts on the structure versus agency, and also distinction between global north and global south. And also, you make a good point on how inequality between countries continues to fall. And I think I'm happy that you have a kind of optimistic views on the development of economic development. Maybe we can deeply discuss about that in the second round of discussion. Maybe I will continue to my second question to Ms. Joanna. It's quite a similar questions about the rising trend on democracy. As of 2022, 70% of the world's population lives under autocratic regimes, with the Asia-Pacific region experiencing the most significant democratic decline, as reported by FIDEM Democracy Report 2023. Maybe, Ms. Joanna, can you tell us your view on this? What key trends are we seeing in Asia now, and why and how did those trends come to life? Please, Ms. Joanna. Yeah.
Thank you, Baitika, and thank you for FPCI and the Women in Foreign Policy for hosting this session. I'm really pleased to be here. Similar to what Professor Emerson said, I'm also optimistic. I choose to be, I would say, realistically optimistic. In part, that I think stems from the work that I do. So with IRI, we are an NGO that works to support and strengthen democracy by empowering people and democratic institutions. And I think when you start from the premise of empowering people, there's signs of optimism everywhere. Right? So, I'm glad you mentioned the VDEM study. I think these meta studies and the data that VDEM has, these are so useful and important, right? They are a perspective on the state of democracy in the world and in the Asia Pacific region in particular. And there's a lot that we can pull from them. But Atika, you mentioned the Freedom House report earlier in your introduction, and you as you said, last year it showed there was this overall decline in democracy worldwide, and it showed that maybe that decline is slowing, right? That almost the same number of countries showed improvements in political rights as those that declined in political rights. So, I think you can look at the studies and think that the big trends look pretty grim, but I'm optimistic because of the trends that emerge when we look from the perspective of empowered people and institutions. Now, when you asked about the Asia Pacific, when I look at Asia Pacific, there's two trends in particular that I think are important to track. I want to say I am not an academic, so these observations are based on our work. It's work that IRI supports across this region, mostly through our local partners. So the first trend I think that's important to look at is that of mobilization of people, right? So sort of it's well known that sort of broad and sustained mobilization of people has been a key indicator of democratic breakthroughs in the past. Right now, across this region, I think we are seeing lots of examples of ways that ordinary people are inserting themselves into political life, right? And that's taking different forms. So first of all, electoral turnout, right? Earlier this year, Thailand, last year in the Philippines, they held national elections where there was record-breaking voter turnout for elections, right? What that tells me is that people believed they had something at stake, right? They understood their vote had meaning, and that was a reason. It was a compulsion to go vote to sort of assert that meaning. Mobilization can take the form of protests, right? In the last several years across the Asia Pacific, we've seen lots of examples of this. Hong Kong is a big example. Thailand again, many examples that took place of protests against the status quo, against perceived corruption in government, against perceived effect of people's rights. Even in more closed societies like in China and Myanmar, there have been ongoing protests. In some places, like in Thailand and in Sri Lanka, protest has evolved for some of the civil society organizations. It's evolved from protest into an ability to engage in sort of constructive policy development, for some of these civil society groups, right? So that's a very positive trend. And then, I think in other places where, mobilization might manifest in just outright resistance, right? And so in a place like Myanmar, where, that even as there's sort of this sort of armed resistance that's taking place against this military junta, across the country, there's this, ordinary citizens continue to demonstrate their commitment to democracy through protests that are happening, across that country. So mobilization is one trend that I think is important to follow. The second trend that I think is important to track is the role of youth. Asia, there's this population bulge in Asia. And so we have a generation, like maybe two generations, who are growing up, entering adulthood, and these are young people who have very different expectations of decision-making, a different relationship to power than their parents and their grandparents. They are, and this is sort of referring to some of the things that Professor Emerson was talking to, they are seeing these disparities of education, disparities in access to jobs, and in economic opportunities. They have had, firsthand experience on the impacts of a global pandemic, of climate change, of the integration of technology into life. And so, I think what we see is as young people are looking at these challenges, they want solutions, right? Who has the solutions to these challenges? And I think what we've seen is that, the young people observe that autocrats, or autocracy, these strongmen leaders, don't necessarily have all the answers. Now, I'm not sure that they necessarily are sold that democracy is the answer either, but what youth in the region have demonstrated is their willingness to take up issues that are of concern to them, right? And that idea of an individual's right to act on issues that are important to them, that is a fundamental building block of democracy. I would also point out that youth have been a driving force in many of the pro-democracy mobilizations that I mentioned earlier. So, just to close out here, I'm not saying there's no easy solutions. This dominance of autocratic regimes around the world that comes across in these kinds of studies, it's daunting, right? It's depressing. I absolutely acknowledge very, very real challenge is I'm sure we're going to talk about this, restrictions on free expression. But I think what these trends show is a desire for freedom and a willingness to act that I think ultimately point away from autocrats and autocracy in the future. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Joanna. I think you pointed out two important, trends in Asia. First is mobilization of people, and then the population growth. And I think I agree that, and it also happened in Indonesia, in many Asian countries. And also thank you for bringing more optimistic views on the democratic situation globally and also in Asian countries. And then I think I will move to my next question for Pak Bambang Harimurti.
Yes.
Hello, Pak Bambang.
Hello.
Yes, referring again. Yes, can you hear me, Pak Bambang?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Referring again to the score of democracy, particularly in Indonesia, we can see that there is a slightly decline actually from 59 in 2022 to 58 in 2023 based on the free report. And how actually do you assess this kind of situation, Indonesia's state of democracy amidst the aforementioned global trends? And I also want to know, will you also have the kind of optimistic view on the development of democracy in Indonesia, Bambang?
Thank you very much, Ika. That's a very good question. If you are right, if you look at Freedom House, the Indonesia Democracy Index is slightly decreased. And also, if you look at other institutions, especially international independent institutions, similar thing happen. If you see, for instance, from the Economist Democracy Index, also Indonesia has been declining recently. Yeah, and actually there are a lot of also Indonesianists, especially foreign observer academics, friends of Pak Don Emerson, who already wrote even a book called The Decline of Indonesian Democracy. Of course, this is not only happening in Indonesia, as you mentioned. This is a global impact, and Indonesia is part of that. But for those who are in the viewers, maybe just to give you a perspective, a global perspective, Indonesia democracy now is lower than Malaysia. Yeah, because we always have this competition with Malaysia. And this only happened a few years ago, because Malaysia becoming more democratic and Indonesia less democratic. And of course, if you want to know which one in ASEAN is the most democratic now, is East Timor, or Timor-Leste. So we are even less democratic than the country we used to colonize. So that's the pessimistic view. But on the optimistic side, I think we are, for instance, we are not under military junta like in Thailand, or in Myanmar, and or in some other like Egypt, So in that sense, we are still what they are called partly democratic, according to partly free, according to the Freedom House, or as the Economist magazine would call it, flawed democracy. But we are actually near the border between partly free to free, or between flawed democracy and full democracy. So we are almost the finish line. If we can keep pushing to have a greater democracy, we can go to full democracy or full freedom. It happened in Indonesia, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017, I think. Freedom House considered Indonesia fully free. Now, if you look at the analytical view, how you can say this country changed from fully free in 2017 to now partly free, it's not because what Professor Emerson says in the structure things, but more in the agencies of actor decline. Yeah. I'm proud to be part of the elite who, during the Reform Marxist time, we were so busy helping to build the right what we call it structures, as Professor Anderson said, the right sector. We have amendment to our constitution, so we have directly elected president, and we have 2 terms limit and all those stuff. Yeah? And at that time, of course, we all can do it because we were fully supported by international communities. Yeah? Especially civil societies really has full support from the international community. Maybe like now, civil society Ukraine got a lot of support from international communities. So the structures were there. Of course, it's not perfect, but at least it is in the right design, I think. Of course, still some flaw here and there. But what changes is actually, as Professor Emerson said, is the agencies or the actors. You know? Because for the young people did not know at that time, they were not born yet or they were still a kid. So they did not know the danger of fascism or the danger of authoritarianism. Yeah? But they are already enjoying the life in a much freer society, especially with the, with media, social, and so on. And in fact, they are now, maybe some of them feel there are too much freedom, especially those who maybe feel damaged or feel scared by the freedom in social media, because every day, maybe even a few minutes after they wake up, they they look at the phone and maybe there is somebody attacking them unjustly, according to them. So there is this is a problem. Some people don't remember again the danger of authoritarianism, but they are now saying the danger of too much freedom. So there is a less commitment to fight for freedom, because the cost of having a good freedom is that you have to also give freedom to those who you don't like, and also those opinions that actually you totally don't agree. Yeah, this is sometimes they call it the you have to defend even the most obnoxious rights. The most obnoxious person also got a right that you have to defend. Of course, this is much better than before, but still, I feel that sometimes there is this democratic fatigue happening because we have a few problems, like during the pandemic. We have economic problem, we have all this kind of problem, and then this Ukraine war, price rising, and all this economic problem. And it can be shown because I think last time there is a poll asking question, if you have to choose between democratic freedom and economic development, only 7% choose for democratic freedom. And I'm sure this is probably the 7% is the very highly educated elite academic civil society type. The rest of the society feel economic freedom is more important. But having said that, I'm still optimistic because as you remember, there was a very great push to have Pak Jokowi in the 3rd term, which is again the constitution. And despite the fact that Pak Jokowi popularity is above 70%, but the other side of it is when people were asked whether we should have more than 2nd term, more than 70% said no. And in this, but having said that, even at that time, I'm still worried because that 70% might be only people that in the field, you know, just ordinary people. But fortunately, one of the political parties, the strongest political party, PDIP, was against it, and of course also Partai Demokrat and so on. So as I'm very optimistic because I think the elite, the agencies, or some people might call it the oligarchy in Indonesia, which many has said has already captured our democratic society, but at least they are not united. So there is still competitions among the oligarchy. As long as there is a competition among the oligarchy, we are still okay. But so we have to ensure that there will remain competition in oligarchy while we are building a better understanding of democratic. So we have this window of opportunity, because if we let the oligarchy become united before we have consolidated our democracy, then we will be in a big problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Pak Bambang, for bringing up some of the important issues. You have highlighted how our neighboring countries are progressing with their democracy, you know, Malaysia and Timor-Leste. And nevertheless, luckily, we are not really under any military rule. And I think it's also important point. And also, yeah, you bring again the optimistic views on the progress of democracy globally and also in Indonesia. And you mentioned about the utilization or the use of media. So I think it's very relevant to my next question to Mbak Ika. Okay, hi Mbak Ika. Okay, my last question will be directed to Mbak Ika. Yeah, Mbak Ika, as we know that freedom of speech is one of the pillars of democracy and an important component of civil liberties. And we all know that you are the chief editor of the Conversation Indonesia, one of the leading media platforms, independent media, right? That showcases news and analysis from the academic community. How do you actually reconcile the importance of freedom of speech and the social media era we are seeing now? Because, you know, we have lots of young people now, they use social media quite frequently. And how do you see this kind of a situation? Please, Mbak.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Atika, for the question. I feel honored to be here with very distinguished speakers and also moderator. Well, addressing freedom of speech in the social media is actually a really delicate issue, if I can say, that requires careful consideration, because as we know, freedom of speech is fundamental human right. It's also important thing for any democratic society. Because it allows individuals to express their opinion, as well encourage democratic participation. But when we're talking about social media, I always consider social media as a tool that can both present opportunities and challenges when it comes to a tool to express opinions. With access to technology, everyone can say whatever they want, and it can be spread easily, right? And social media can also amplify messages that are created so people's voices can really be heard. But the other side is that social media can also present challenges in the way that they can facilitate the spread of misinformation, hate speech, and then hoaxes as well. And this ease of sharing information can lead to the, it will harm social cohesion, and as well as probably incite violence, as it is happening in previous election that I heard happening in Malaysia election last year. And then when we try to balance things out between, ensuring freedom of expression, while at the same time addressing the negative impact of social media usage, I think it requires a multifaceted platforms that also involve multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder. In this we have to include the involvement of the government as well as the media and also social media platforms, or we can say tech companies as well. Even though I'm quite, I have doubts in the current governments in the way that they have, as we can see, they have sort of a very unpredictable nature when it comes to policy making. As we remember that last year, at the end of last year, DPR issued the criminal code law that somehow it's also include a contentious article that basically threat the freedom of expression, where people who are criticizing the governments or the president may be put in jail. So those kind of unpredictable, because like they have many big discussion around it, and all the public is pretty much against it, but somehow the law is passed. That's why I'm not really fond of including the governments in this case. But I would like to stress probably the greater role of social media platforms in this case is tech companies, because as we know, Maria Ressa, journalist and Nobel Prize winner, has complained so many times how social media platforms should have done more to address the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation. And based on my experience, it's really hard to engage social media platforms, to ask them to involve in this cause of addressing misinformation and disinformation in Indonesia. Like the Conversation Indonesia itself is involved in various initiative, fact-checking initiative. And when we try to reach out to social media platforms and we want to discuss about so many things, including their content moderation policy, it seems so hard for us to just sit together and discuss about things, because we believe, it's important to engage them, because social media platforms should be more transparent, right, about their content moderation policy as well as the decision-making process that they have. And there's also, I think it's important to have a stronger civic role. In this sense, we can do this by empowering the citizen, by promoting media literacy and as well education among citizens. And I've seen many public initiative launched for this purpose. Many of our others who are academics have shared their initiative in digital literacy, and some of them share their programs and research, and we publish their research as well on our website. So at the end, I can say that these collaborative efforts between the public, the media, the tech companies will sort of pave the way to create a more vibrant democratic society where people can express their opinions under the social media era that is quite challenging right now. I think that's
Okay, thank you, Mbak Ika. Yes, I think
Atika, could I just jump in and with a quick observation here, if that's all right?
Yeah.
Because I want to just sort of amplify the point that Ika made about media literacy. I think one of the things that we've seen, and it was sort of became particularly brought into focus during the pandemic, was the struggle that even established democracies had of sort of how to mount democratic responses to the challenges that Ika laid out, right? That social media bring, and so this is an area where I think there has been particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, there has been a lot of experimentation done. You know, I was interested to hear about sort of what she was talking about here in Indonesia. I think in countries like Taiwan, there's been models of how to mount these democratic responses, focusing on media literacy, having sort of empowering both sort of government officials, but also civil society to sort of work together on these things. And there are other examples to draw upon, but this is an area where I think that the learning that can be done and exchanged across democracies is actually really, really quite important, and it's something that you know, as Democrats, you know, small D Democrats are looking at this in Indonesia or elsewhere. You know, look across the region for some cases, some examples that might be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Joanna, for adding some points, important points. I think I agree, and I will echo also about the importance of social media literacy in our democracy to strengthen our democracy. And also, thank you, Mbak Ika, for acknowledging the two roles of social media that provide opportunities as well as challenges. And I think, yeah, the need for, I agree also when you mention about the need to stronger civic rules and social media literacy, and also collaboration between government, civil society, academicians. Really, I think really crucial in that sense. Okay, I think we had an engaging and fruitful discussion in the first round. It's quite, interesting, from theoretical frameworks about structure, agency, about global south, global north, as mentioned by Prof. Emerson, to the role of media, social media, in providing opportunities as well as challenges for our democracy. I think we will be moving to the second round of discussion that probably will focus on the experiences of the US and Indonesia on democracy, including the opportunity to build, democratic resilience. Okay, maybe I will start the second round of discussion from Ms. Joanna. Is it okay? Because you have raised some, I think, some important points about the social media literacy, that kind of things. Now, I think we will talk about democratic resilience. And I think, yeah, social media, like you mentioned, also play important roles in making the resilient. And hearing all the challenges mentioned before, like Pak Bambang mentioned about the oligarchy, and Mbak Ika mentioned about the unpredictable situations, and you mentioned also about resistance, that some forms of challenges. What are actually the policy choices that could enhance a nation's democratic resilience? And I can see that you will be optimistic on the direction of our democracy. Can you share your views on that?
Thank you. Yes, this is such a good question. I mean, we just heard, right, about how the challenges that we face, they are so complex and so interconnected. And I think this idea of resilience, it really gets to the idea that because the challenges are so complex, they require responses to match that, right? So, we're talking about resilience, right? I think just want to talk about what I think this means, right, in the context of democracy, right? So this is a resilient system. It's a system that can deal with complex challenges, right, and can deal with pressures. A resilient system is one that is able to be flexible and adaptable and innovative. These are characteristics that help political systems to absorb stress, and then to change, right, to adapt and in response to that stress. So, I'm sure it will not surprise you if I'm asked what I think can help a country to be more resilient. I'm going to say more democracy, right? Because when democracy and democratic institutions are working, and that's an important piece, when they're working, they are designed to, they are built to respond to changing priorities. So resilience is enhanced by strengthening democratic institutions and practices, right? And so I would be looking for policies that can do that. Just to kind of go through, some of these key institutions and the policies that can support them, as Ika mentioned, this whole idea of freedom of expression as a key pillar of democracy is critical, right? But it's also very tough. Listening to Pak Bambang talk about, the sort of the sense of too much freedom and having to sort of ensure the right to freedom of expression of people who you really disagree with, right? These are tough questions for democracies to grapple with, but policies that protect free expression, that build information integrity, that build the media literacy that Mbak Ika was talking about, all of these are really, I think, really critical policies to focus on in terms of building this pillar of resilience. I talked earlier about mobilization of people as a sort of a democratic indicator, right? And so policies that increase inclusion across societies, like increasing women's participation, like ensuring that historically marginalized communities are able to participate. All of these things strengthen resilience because the greater the participation in a democracy, the more resilient that society is going to be. Along those lines, policies that enable the holding of credible and regular elections, right? So that the evolving priorities of voters can be reflected in governance, right? Those kinds of policies will strengthen resilience. Transparency and accountability, right? Policies that strengthen those systems can both help to build confidence in how decisions are being made, so people can see how decisions are being made, but also these kinds of policies can ensure that there's no abuse, like corruption, like this trend toward oligarchy that Pak Bambang was talking about, right? The transparency and accountability policies can ensure there's nothing that will distort, the system. And so these are big buckets of policies, right? They're very big, and they can't be siloed, right? They are very interdependent. When you sort of mentioned like being optimistic. Am I optimistic? Yes, I am. Of course I am. I said that I'm realistically optimistic. I do think, and I was thinking about this listening to the conversation that we were all having just previously, is democracy gets a bad name, right? Because of a perception that it doesn't deliver on all of these promises. But democracy doesn't just happen, right? It doesn't kind of get delivered to a people, to a country. There's that very famous saying that democracy is a journey and not a destination. And so when we were talking, about these trends, when I was talking about sort of the hopeful trends that I see, I mean, that's really what feeds my optimism on this question of resilience too. Because, thinking through some of those trends that I mentioned, a mobilized people, who want to take action on issues of importance to them, maybe they vote in elections and choose candidates and then hold those candidates accountable. And then maybe those elected officials take up some of these policy issues that are going to build resilience because they recognize that more resiliency is good for their own national sovereignty and security, right? And so that process, that doesn't just slow down democratic decline, it can actually start to turn it around and start to show how democracy can deliver. And so I'll stop there. I'm looking forward to hearing others' thoughts on this as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I can see Pak Bambang want to say something. Please, Pak Bambang, you can
Yes.
want to respond.
Thank you very much, Ika. I just want to continue on the previous speaker. I think we, especially in Indonesia, now we are entering this second phase of democratization. And talking about resilience, this is where it is most needed. Because now, if you look at all the numbers, why the Freedom House created this number 58, 59, and of course the economists created this democracy index. If you look at the decline in Indonesia, it's not in the area of the structures, as Professor Don Emerson said, but on the actors or agency side, which is mainly civil liberties. This is a much more harder in civil liberties because then you are, as most American would say, it's something like a cultural war or value war. Yeah, and if you look at the history of democracy in United States, they have to go through civil wars which very bloody civil wars, in order to reach a new value that the North believe is a modern values. Yeah. And because their economic interests different between the South and the North at that time regarding the slave especially. And we look in India, for instance, now, Modi actually won the election because of the reaction to this value war, especially with the Hindus' values. Yeah. So we have to be careful. I think most of the setback in democratic countries in the world now is because of this value war, which create a good opportunity for a mobocracy, or what I would call the populist leader, to use this hatred to minorities, hatred to people with different values, as a way to win votes. Even in Israel now, I think you can see the problem of democratic values. Yeah. So this is a much tougher battle to win, I think. And I hope we don't have to go through like a civil war in America to win this battle. Yeah. But usually we will be faring better because we can learn from history. That's why we have to learn not only from the history of our own country, but the history of democratic development in other countries, and especially the successful one. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Bambang, for highlighting some of the important issues. And because you mentioned about the US, so I will give the next chance to Prof. Emerson to really give response on the US experiences. So, Prof. Emerson, how does actually the US address this kind of challenges? We already mentioned lots of challenges. However, we also see some optimistic view. And are you seeing any ambition from the US to build, democratic resilience like this? Do you have any say?
I'm sorry, I probably should have intervened earlier. I did want to comment on the discussion so far, if I could. I mean, the American I'm not sure that the Civil War in the United States is particularly relevant to the circumstances, at least in countries like Indonesia and so forth. Let's remember that, among other things, the Civil War was about slavery. This leads directly into the autonomy of the individual in a democratic system. But it also raises a potential problem. I mean, of all of the philosophical alternatives, including communism and fascism and so forth, there's one alternative to democracy, as I understand it, to normal, successful democracy, that is often omitted from the discussion. And that is extreme libertarianism, which is all about the individual. It's located in the individual and the individual's inalienable rights. There's a kind of a cowboy equivalent early in the development of the United States. I mean, if you were arriving, if you will, for the first time, in an unpopulated area. I used to be in Wisconsin, so imagine Wisconsin, right? And, you've got a neighbor whom you don't like. Well, you can just get up and move, right? One study of the rights and freedoms that are most cherished by Americans was done by a professor of mine at Yale. Among other things, he went around to local cafes and bars and talked to blue-collar workers. These are people without college degrees, typically, who are, manual labor kind of people. And he would ask them, he said, well, what's the freedom that you cherish the most? And as an intellectual, not surprisingly, I suppose, he was thinking to himself, as I might as well, it's got to be freedom of speech. That's really the basic freedom. And the answer was very different. The answer came from these people. No, freedom that I value the most is my freedom to get in my truck and drive from here in Connecticut all the way across country to California without asking anyone's permission. Nobody needs to give me the permission to do that. I can do that myself, right? The sovereignty of the individual. Well, frankly, libertarianism is a disaster in democracy in the 21st century. I mean, with the growth of population around the planet, I mean, in Southeast Asia, in wet rice societies, in the deltas of Southeast Asia, libertarianism, which, you know, is interpreted in the Wild West, back when I'm talking about, you know, a century or two ago, that's my right to swing my fist just shy of your nose, you know, almost to your nose, but I'm not touching your nose. So that's my freedom. That's my freedom. Well, that's catastrophic, because obviously that is the beginning of war, and, you know, all kinds of problems immediately arise from that deification of the sovereignty of the individual. And what that means is that it's necessary for the 21st century version of democracy. And let's remember, democracy is not a thing. It's an experiment. And it's an experiment that has tremendous differences and points in different directions. And one of the experiments that I think is really overdue is the way in which democracy, particularly in the United States and some other countries, can be adapted to the need for community. You know, the problem with some of the communities is that they feel completely left out of the whole process. You know, I happen to be a professor at, you know, Stanford University. Stanford University is an elite university. Once, as a joke, I put on my, you know, there's a little place I can put stuff next to my office door, and I put an announcement that Stanford was so competitive that this year it had decided to accept no one in the entering class as proof of how extremely elitist, you know, Stanford was. Now, this was a joke. You know, this is, I mean, obviously that would not happen in reality. But the emphasis on the individual needs to be reconsidered, and the focus on communities and the need for community, I think, becomes more important. I'm happy to talk also about the situation in the United States now, if you'd like me to. But those are a couple of comments that I did want to make. And I could make another comment or two, but I don't want to take up too much time. And I will be happy to talk about the election coming up next year here in the U.S.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Emerson, again to highlight some of the multiple interpretation of freedom, sovereignty of individuals, and, you know, it can be different.
Lisa?
And I think I can see Mbak Ika hand. Maybe you two Mbak Ika?
Yes, I think I'm just gonna respond on. Hello? Yes, can you hear me well?
Yeah, Mbak Ika, yeah, please.
Okay, I just want to respond on the democracy resilience. Probably let's not forget about the role of media in this case, because media is the fourth pillars of the democracy, and we see reports how democracy in Indonesia is regressing and it's worsening under Jokowi's administration. And one of the main reason, basically, I could say that it's related to the condition of the press in the country. As we know that the Indonesia media landscape is getting more concentrated in that sense, because like from having 13 media conglomerates in 2011 to only 8 media big companies in 27 based on the latest reports, and one of them is Tempo, Pak Bambang. So yeah, so if we take a look at the people behind this media, their owners, and how they are associated with either, you know, business or political interests. Some of them are, as we know, without mentioning name, chairman of political parties in Indonesia, and this really raises concern in the way that the media can be misused, you know, by their owners for their own interests. But I want to also share optimism with other speakers here. I can see that in the past 5 or 7 years, there are this new online media, independent media. They're mostly online. They operate outside the system, the capitalistic system. They don't. Most of them are profit, I believe, and they produce also high quality journalism focusing on specific issue, and they're mostly critical and questioning as well the government policy. I can mention some of them. Some of their names are Kata Data, Madeline, Konde.co, Kabar Sejuk, and the latest one probably everyone here is also know Project Mutatuli, and as well the Conversation Indonesia. So our approach is somehow we would like to promote dialogues and publish different opinions and perspective that can somehow, be important to continue promoting democracy. And so despite the concentrated nature of our media landscape now, I still have high hopes for media Indonesia because the emergence of this small newsroom. And that's how probably we can see the part on how democracy can be resilient, driven by the roles of this media. And however, despite their important roles in that sense to sustain democracy in Indonesia, we do have also our own problems in a matter of sustainability, because we don't have strong financial backups like those big medias. The Conversation Indonesia, for example, we are still mainly supported by donors, and it's not really sustainable. And this is why I think we believe if we are taking at the role of media as one of the fundamental element in a democracy, we have to support this small newsroom, because somehow our democracy relies on their existence. That's from me.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Mbak Ika, for also contribute to the how to build democratic resilience by pointing out the role of media. Actually, I want to also maybe explore, but I see Pak Bambang maybe want to give comments, please, Pak Bambang.
Yeah,
But
thank you. I just
follow me.
yeah,
Oh,
thank
okay.
you. I just
No,
want. Oh, sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
Thank you. I
Yeah,
just
please,
want
Pak
to
Bambang.
continue on this media because there is Professor Don Emerson here. I like also to add that true that the conglomerate of media is also getting smaller, as you mentioned, but at least they are still in competition, not belonging to one group with the same ideology of idea. That's why we are still okay. But this big media, I think, is representing journalism in the maybe what we call in American academic the Walter Lippmann side of the story, the elitist story. But we have more than 40,000 new online media now since the internet, which probably more representing the John Dewey side of the debate. So that is healthy because we have both Walter Lippmann and John Dewey. Yeah? But as you mentioned, I'm also worried about on the side of the John Dewey, there is not sustainability of the financial side is still very dependent on donor and so on, which is in the long term not sustainable. Because I was on the board of the Democratic Force of Burma for a while, so I understand this very well. But that's why I think one of the solution is I think the government and the press council and all the media industry is now trying to strike a better deal with the platform, especially like global, Google and Facebook and so on. If they can give a better revenue sharing to this small internet-based media, and it will ensure more of their sustainability and freedom of the press. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Bambang, for bringing another issue, but like Mbak Ika said, about funding issue, right? Funding issues and that kind of things. And okay, we already talked about some of the challenges and maybe potential opportunities. And actually, I just want to raise one issues to Mbak Ika. You mentioned about the role of media in building democratic resilience, but I also interesting to know your view about the role of young people, youth, because you wrote an article about Don't Give Up Just Yet on Indonesia's democracy, the power of youth. How do you think the involvement of youth in politics could be considered probably as the silver of hope for defending and advancing democracy? Can you tell us maybe a brief about this article to us, Mbak Ika?
Thank you. That I wrote actually 3 years ago. I was afraid that I was the only one who is optimist in this session, you know. But I'm really glad to hear that I share the same optimism right now with the others. So if I can share what I wrote in the past. So basically, I wrote that article at the height when student protests erupted, responding to various controversial bills that are discussed in the parliament, including labor bills as well as anti-corruption bills at the time. And somehow those events brought me back to memories 20 years ago when I was still a high school student, where I witnessed how students, you know, managed to topple the authoritarian regime of New Order. So that's, yeah, called me nostalgic, but somehow it bring me, you know, hope that it will happen again. But as we know, nothing much changes actually. And if I'm using Pak Don words between structure and agency, I can sense that the structure is stronger than the agency. We know now those two controversial bills are being passed into law, and those protests seems to have fallen to deaf ears, and the oligarchic power seems to get stronger than ever, even though Pak Bambang mentioned that there are competition between them. But I do see it that they are still one ally, Pak Bambang, in a way that, you know, there's only one major power in the parliament right now. And we can discuss that more, of course. But I still have my optimism. Maybe that's, yeah, just the optimist me saying this, because, yeah, I'm a mother of 2 daughters, and it's important me to be optimist, you know, because it's related to the future of my daughters. So yeah, and I just want to say that across the history, our nation history, that we can't really underestimate the power of youth, because it was the young people who initiated changes, starting from the Independence Day movement to reform era in 1998. And with technology, especially social media, like I mentioned before, that I considered it as a tool. I believe that these young people, or one scholar, Ariel Herianto, I really like his word when he mentioned this generation as urban intelligentsia. With this tool that they have, social media, they have the power to continue to push for changes in mobilizing public opinion and challenging the status quo. The thing that Joanna mentioned earlier about the mobilization that we need to sustain our democracy is crucial there. And facilitated by this digital technology, I can also see that what I've shared before, the role of this independent media also take part there, mostly driven by young people, who are not really satisfied with the current media system and demanding for a change. And we do not only talk about the media in a formal format, because there are also blogs wrote by young people, social media posts created by young generation to share their thoughts and minds, responding all the social political challenges right now. I've myself founded this movement related to changing the narratives of a 1965 tragedy in Indonesia. We call it Ingat 65, or Remember 1965. So me and a group of friends set up this blog, inviting young people to share their thoughts about what they understand about the tragedy, the understanding of young generation about the tragedy. With this movement, we're trying to change the existing narrative of 1965, because most of Indonesians believe that 1965 was when 6 generals were killed due to the coup by Indonesian Communist Party. PKI, but what they don't know is that more than 500,000 people were killed due to their association with PKI. And we really want to show that there are also injustice and impunity related to discrimination against family members as well as the victim. And we can see that this kind of movement happening in other topics, mostly environmental, as you can see with the Greta Thunberg, you know, and there's also a sense of urgency there, I guess. Yeah, that's basically what I want to share, actually, sharing my optimism with these young people and then the new media that we do have now in the existing political and social landscape in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you so much, Mbak Ika. Thank you so much also another speaker, Prof. Emerson, Ms. Joanna, and Pak Bambang for sharing your thoughts. I think we are now moving to the Q&A sessions, and I will kindly remind rules before the session. First, we respectfully participants to keep their microphones muted while the panelists are speaking and answer the question. And you are welcome to raise question either through the chat box and the Q&A box, or you will also given the chance to directly ask your question on your own during the Q&A session. And probably due to time constraint, we ask participants to deliver their question concisely, and if possible, direct your question to one speaker only. And I think I can see one participant who raised her hand. Okay, you can start, mention your names and where you come from, and also who speaker that you want to direct your question. Please, from Parahyangan.
Yes, thank you very much, Mbak Atika. It was really interesting sessions. Thank you for all the panelists. I'm Anggia from Department of IR, Parahyangan University in Bandung. I would like to ask particularly to Mbak Ika and Johanna. But I think Prof. Emerson and Pak Bambang would give valuable thoughts on this as well. Let's talking about the woman as an agent of democracy in particular. How do you see the access of social media influences women's understanding of politics as well as to women's political participation? I would like to know what you observe. What have you been observed in your country on your previous research? That's all. Thank you, Mbak Atika.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Anggi. Probably, yeah. Maybe Joanna, do you want to, try to address the question Mbak Anggi asked about the women as an
Sure.
access of media, how the women influence the access of media influence their participation, political participation?
I'm happy to start, and then I'm also interested to hear Mbak Ika's perspectives on this. I mean, you know, I think our experience is, you know, when I look across Asia, the political participation of women, right? Women face so many challenges from the beginning, right? To be able to engage, whether it's sort of religious or sort of like structural issues and economic issues, cultural issues. So women already have a lot of challenges to overcome to be able to participate in the political system. For example, you know, I'm not sure if the question was referring to women, you know, running in elections or just being able to politically engage. But either way, women generally, I think, face greater challenges. The way that social media has played into that has added, I think, an element of more risk, right? Because of the ways in which social media has been abused in a lot of cases, where, you know, you look at the Filipino elections, the use of red tagging, you know, the ability of sort of people who are online to sort of go after individuals and really single them out, you know, the sort of digital threats that women face. I think all of that has really been exacerbated, and there are actually sort of quite significant lines of work looking quite specifically at how to support women and support in every way, right? I mean, not just with sort of helping to build skills, but also how to sort of help them emotionally prepare for what it means to sort of self-select to participate in the political system. So, you know, I think I think with any question that relates to social media and politics, there's huge upsides. There's the necessity of it, right? I mean, you have so many countries in this part of the world. You know, I think about places like Timor, or what it used to be like in Myanmar, where Facebook is literally the internet, right? And so you cannot run a political campaign, you cannot think about political engagement without using social media. And yet there are also these huge downsides that need to be reckoned with, and tools that I think need to be help to be put in place. And Ika, I'm going to kick over to you, because you had talked about, you know, the challenges of working with some of the social media companies, you know, and I think that's a piece of the solution. But I think it requires sort of broader policy thinking as well. But Ika, I'm curious your thoughts here too.
Yeah, please, Ika. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Joanna. I agree with you. I concur with you actually, but without undermining the threats that social media have upon our society. I want to also to share, especially for women, that we can also think or consider social media as, again, our tool, you know, our tool that can empower us in terms of election. Probably the one that has been asked is that we can see how social media is being used by women in Indonesia to sort of speak up, you know. We can see that many stories especially on domestic violence, where women using social media to just share to the public that they are suffering, they are victims. Those are one of the avenues that women can actually use to be more empower individuals. And in terms of election, I believe that women can also use, you know, to navigate social media to help them get information, as many as it's possible, to give them enough information to lead them to have an informed decision before they made up something in the election day. Those are the things that I imagine that we can do as women in terms of using social media in that sense, even though I also understand the need of, you know, media literacy in this case, to avoid any misuse or, you know, anything that is possibly happening for women as a group that is vulnerable in our society. The things that mentioned by Joanna, like tagging and those kind of thing, and doxing as well, is really rampant in among women journalists in Indonesia, especially. So yeah, I'm just going to add that, you know, optimist view on how women can actually use social media to empower themselves. That's for me.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ika, for adding some of the answer. Okay. I will read some question for for other speakers. First, is from Rian, Indonesia. The question is for Prof. Emerson. I want to ask Prof. Emerson about the interlinkage between foreign policy and democracy. During the post-Cold War unipolar moment, we see the US being very active in importing democracy abroad. With recent development, are you seeing this trend being maintained, or what are your observations on this, the relation between foreign policy and democracy? Please, Prof. Emerson.
Okay, that's a fascinating topic. We really don't have time to go into it in a lot of depth. And we haven't talked about the domestic electoral situation here in the United States at all, and I don't think we're going to have time to do that either, which is really unfortunate. But here's what I would say. The United States is a democracy. Indonesia is a democracy with comments and footnotes and variations and so forth. Let's remember that, you know, if Indonesia is a flawed democracy, those who use the phrase, I'm thinking of The Economist, consider America to be a flawed democracy. And in that context, there's an Indonesian phrase that I find very attractive, although I may misunderstand it a little bit. mawas diri, which probably for some people is kind of a bad thing. But for me, it's a good thing. It's introspection. One of the reasons that I enjoy Indonesia so much is that I find many Indonesians are introspective. We've had evidence of that just now, right? In terms of reconsidering 1965, in terms of what actually happened, rather than, leaving it aside or have some kind of propagandistic interpretation emphasizing one aspect rather than another. So is the United States a democratic imperialist? That's the question. And what I mean by that is the United States spreading democracy around the world, whether people want it or not? I mean, that would be an extreme version of what is actually a very different situation. Democracy is not something that you put in a package and then put in the mail to send overseas. No. Every country is unique. The fact that liberal democracy originated in what we now choose to call the West means that it is a particular kind of democracy. Is there a communitarian democracy? I think there is, with, of course, established rules with regard to freedom of speech and the autonomy of the individual, but not carried to the extreme point of the libertarian position. And so, I think to some extent, the United States, especially given what is happening politically, we have now a tie. I should mention this because we haven't talked about this at all, that indicates that there are, of the people who are asked, registered voters who presumably intend to vote in November of next year in the American election, 43% support Trump and 43% support Biden, which you can see is either good news or bad news. You might expect more people to support Biden than that. I mean, I could go into the argument. We don't have time to discuss that. But I'm mentioning that only to suggest that the character of American democracy, which is under extreme pressure at the moment, 43% on each side is better than a majority for Donald Trump, because in my personal opinion, and I am free to say this, of course, Donald Trump would be catastrophic as president again of the United States. He would be vengeful. I mean, I can go on and on. We don't have time for that. It would be really a very, very unfortunate outcome. And so, frankly, my own sense of the U.S. position on democracy abroad is to encourage democracy abroad. Yes, absolutely. There's nothing wrong in that. But not to force it on anyone. Not to say that, you've got to be a democracy, and if you don't become a democracy, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. In fact, the problem is that some people accuse the United States of being hypocritical, because on the one hand, a country may not be exactly democratic, but on the other hand, for other reasons, like economic reasons, it's important to the American interest. And so the U.S. government decides to deal with that government, even though they're a little bit, they're not really pleased to do that, but up to a point, as long as there are no sort of egregious violations of the kind that we see, for example, in Myanmar at the moment, then maybe that can be done. And there is an interesting contrast in this regard that I do want to mention. Perhaps this is helpful, I don't know, between the Bali Democracy Forum in Indonesia, which I have attended periodically over the years, and the community of democracy, if you will, or the effort to bring democratic countries together under some kind of umbrella to discuss the importance of democracy that the United States is involved in, and yes, is certainly encouraging as itself a democracy. The difference between those two approaches, to some extent, is this: that Indonesia would invite anyone. I mean, I'm exaggerating to some extent, but basically, if you are an autocracy, you could still get an invitation to the Bali Democracy Forum. And the argument would be that although you guys are authoritarians, I don't know, Hungary, for example, right? Relatively authoritarian. You guys are authoritarians, but we're not going to leave you outside of the meeting. We want you to come to the meeting. And I suppose some Indonesians who are particularly committed to democracy would argue that if foreign autocracies can come to Bali and listen to arguments in favor of democracy, maybe they will change their minds. Now, whether that is naive or not, I guess I leave it up to you to judge. but it does mean that the Bali Democracy Forum is a totally different operation, in which there's not an effort to bring together countries that share democracy, not at all, but rather to sell. And frankly, to be perfectly honest, I don't mean to be unfairly critical. I hope you won't take this as unfair criticism. But the very fact that Bali is such an attractive place to be, that, I think the Hungarians and others who come in are maybe as much touristic for other reasons. And of course, Indonesia likes the Bali Democracy Forum because a lot of people come to Indonesia and then they become tourists and so forth and so on. So there is a self-interest there as well. But the ability of the democracies of the world today to gather and to act as a bloc is not only difficult, although obviously, particularly with regard to Ukraine, it is a dramatic reminder that democracies do have something in common. And that, of course, is respect for the sovereignty of a country, the refusal to tolerate the utterly unjustified invasion of a country, as we've seen Vladimir Putin undertake. And so the unity, in fact, some people were surprised, the relative unity of the West, quote unquote, the West, caused, ironically, by the invasion, to some extent, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, is an example of how democracies do share a lot in common. And there are differences between them. That's really important to emphasize. I would argue that for various reasons, including the pandemic, including AI, and the need to do something, frankly, fairly straightforward and firm with regard to the dangers that are inherent. I live in Silicon Valley, so I'm acutely aware of this, to artificial intelligence. And I could go on. There are various challenges to the world that to some extent share the following conclusion. The state must be involved. The state must be involved. Now, if I wanted to be provocative, I would say, does this mean that it is possible in the future to think of something like constructive censorship? Can censorship ever be constructive? In Sweden, you burn a Quran, you don't go to jail. It's your right to burn a Quran. Now, there's an argument on both sides, and I'm not going to take a position on that, except to say that, the importance of trying to make sure that state intervention, because it's going to be absolutely essential. Already we have the example of the European Union. Can democracies survive without some attention to the need for moderation? And when I say that, yes, moderation, so that an extreme position that threatens violence, I mean, that's, after all, one of the reasons that Trump, I hope, will go to jail, if he ever does, and that may not happen, but still, is precisely because his language leading up to the 6th of January that we just mentioned but haven't had a chance to discuss, his language was like, putting a match to light a fire, which is what happened at the U.S. Capitol. And it was a horrific experience, and probably, it was essentially a coup d'etat in process, if I may use that phrase. And so obviously there has to be some kind of response to that, which should not be repressive. But the notion, for example, take bad speech, right? Speech that is vilifying, that is dangerous because it calls upon people to engage in violence and to kill people and so forth and so on. That's bad speech. So traditionally, right, the standard libertarian would say, well, the solution to bad speech is not good speech, it's more speech. My answer to that is, you mean like more bad speech? You think that's the solution? Okay, there might be a little good speech as well. No, I mean, incendiary speech, frankly, has no place in a democracy. And it seems to me that the idealists among us who still have this kind of, heavenly image of democracy as some sort of, perfect solution. No, nothing is perfect, including democracy. And it's vital that the United States and other democratic countries, including Indonesia, begin considering very carefully how they're going to deal with these issues with regard to AI, with regard to freedom of expression, Maria Ressa, we gave her an award here, and she's a very powerfully persuasive example of the struggle that journalists and others, Bambang comes to mind immediately, are undertaking in order to preserve freedom of speech. But freedom of speech occurs in a context, and it's in the context of those structures, right? And if the structures are communitarian, if they share not only values, but economic opportunity, all of those good things that democracy presumably can help contribute to a country, I'm all in favor of it. But the notion that democracy is already perfect and doesn't need to be experimented with is absurd, because it is an experiment. And I'll just say one other thing. Remember that democracy is about the institutionalization of uncertainty. Uncertainty is vital in a democracy, because who knows, will Biden win? Will Trump win? We do not know that. And not only do we not know that, but it is vital that we not know that, because that's a fundamental part of what democracy is. So you see where I'm headed. And I think that kind of a journey, that kind of an exercise, whether it's in Indonesia or in the Philippines or in the US or any other country, is absolutely vital. And I'm sure that, the Americans and others in Western Europe and so forth would be happy to share any kind of support for that initiative, that kind of, and again, going back to Mawas Diri, that introspective approach to democracy, where it's not something for other people, but it's something that you have to consider yourself, however difficult that may be.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Prof. Emerson, for your, very comprehensive kind of response on, you highlight some important points about the, democracy should not be used to justify violations and should be the need for moderation in democracy. Okay, I still have one last question for Pak Bambang from the audience, and please, Bambang, to give your brief response, okay? Yeah.
Okay.
The question is from Sinta, Indonesia. I agree with Pak Bambang in regards to the fact that the setbacks or backsliding we see now is mostly linked to the civil liberties aspect. How do we address these challenges, Pak Bambang?
Well, this is not easy to answer. Very good questions, but I think exposed to more and more different cultures. Young people. The good thing is young people are more exposed to different culture because of internet. Exposed more to different opinion and views. Younger people, younger generation than me, for instance, is more open to different of opinion than my generation or my parent generations. Yeah, because of social media. That's a good effect of social media. And that's why I want also to a bit comment on Pak Don Emerson on Bali Democratic Forum, because I'm partly involved in the founding of it. I think Bali Democratic Forum is actually the what you call it sophisticated name, but the real generic name is actually Authoritarianism Anonymous, just like Alcoholic Anonymous. So this is a place where authoritarian countries or former authoritarian countries come to sit together to share experiences, and then people, the newly democratic countries, we say we used to be authoritarian, but we've been so many years democratic, and then everybody clap hands. But remember, the most successful organization for addiction is Alcoholic Anonymous. You can Google it, you can research it. So, and I think this will be more effective than Democracy Club, because when we go to Democratic Club countries, what they do is they're saying how good democracy and how bad authoritarian countries, and no authoritarian countries come. Right. So it's kind of like what you call it, preaching for the converted. Right. But in Bali, it's actually a very effective way, first to try to convince those still in authoritarian countries, you can move into democratic society and be safe, and even better. And to those newly democratic countries, how to keep far from being authoritarian again. So that's the generic name of it. And I think this is on foreign policy. I don't know, Professor Emerson, are you also the supporter of democratic peace theory? Because no two democratic country will wage war against each other. That's the basic theory. So in this theory, if all countries in the world is democratic, then the word peace will be there.
I am not an absolute supporter of that theory. I think it's much too simple. Reality is more complicated.
Okay. Yeah, I think we should maybe facilitate FPCI to have another discussion about democracy. And really, I mean, today's discussion really very engaging, very informative, very interesting. And because we run out of time, I think we need to end our discussion today.
Can I end with one question for everybody?
Oh,
Just
okay.
one question.
Okay.
This is especially for women. Why are countries that led by women, but countries in egalitarian society always rank very high in democratic rank or human development rank? But countries that are not egalitarian, that are traditionalist, led by women, like India under and UK and Sri Lanka, wage war. It's very different. In egalitarian society, women led to a much better democratic and human development. But in traditional society, women led its countries to war. Why?
I think that's less to do with the women.
Okay. I think
Right.
anyone, I mean, want to have a quick response on Pak Bambang's question?
I had one session with Bu Sri Mulyani, our finance minister. So she told me about, being a female leaders means that when you compare it with the male leaders, is that they are more empathetic, they use their feelings and they think about everything. While I don't know, male or man probably only focus on one thing and just focus on that. But with women, they think about everything, And being a mother, she say also is kind of like really helpful because we are used to, multitask and juggle everything at once. That's basically what I understand,
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mbak Ika.
Probably can answer your question, Pak Bambang.
Yeah, I think I will suggest FPCI to have the discussion on the topic about women leadership or gender leadership. I mean, I think it will be an interesting issue for our next discussion. Okay, I think again, thank you so much, Prof. Emerson, Pak Bambang, Ms. Joanna, Mbak Ika, for such an interesting discussion. I think before we end our discussion, I would like to invite the speakers for a short photo session. Okay, and maybe the committee could help me. Okay, I can count. Please prepare your best your best smile. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's all. Okay, thank you again. It has been an engaging and fruitful discussion, and I'm sure the audience found the discussion on democracy, good governance issue very interesting and informative. And I think before we end the session, I make note some of the Prof. Emerson said that democracy is an experiment, and Johanna said that democracy is a journey, right? And I want to share an important quote from John F. Kennedy, the former president of the United States. He said that democracy is never a final achievement. Okay, it is a call for an untiring effort. It's kind of it's become part of the process, right? Democracy. And we hope that the people around the world, including in Indonesia, stay faithful to the democratic process and hold our commitment to democracy. And for your information, today's event is available for rewatch on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. And thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. You can follow our social media handles for more information about our activities, events, and programs. Also, stay tuned to our next Women in Foreign Policy public discussion series via Instagram or Twitter at FPCindo. See you at the next FPCI event. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.